Welcome back to Case of the Sunday Scaries. I'm Elyse, and today I'm doing something a little bit different. Obviously, there will be a whole new case coming your way, but today I wanted to look back over the episodes and the cases that I've already covered and review all the major updates. We're going to be talking about the conviction that happened in the Delphi murders, Lori Vallow pulling a Ted Bundy and representing herself in court in her upcoming trial, not to mention the recent Dateline interview. And wow, do I have a lot to say about that. And I also want to talk about the recovery of Suzanne Morphew's remains, the mom who disappeared on Mother's Day. Before we get started on all the case updates, I wanted to touch on a case that has been in the news recently. If you listened to last week's interview with Alexa, the producer of the Netflix Gabby Petito documentary, at the end we touched on the horrible atrocities that are happening to Indigenous women across the country. Tragically, on Valentine's Day of this year, a 14-year-old San Carlos Apache girl named Emily Pike was found discarded on the side of the road in Arizona. She had run away from a group home 17 days earlier, but what happened during those days is still not known, or at least not to the public anyway. There is understandably a public outcry for justice to be brought to the person or persons responsible for the death of Emily. She was 14 years old. 14. And yeah, she had a history of running away, but sadly, that's not uncommon for children in foster care and group homes. But if you see a TikTok or anything about Emily's case, please make sure to share because her killer has to be brought to justice. And frankly, any person capable of hurting a child, much less destroying her remains in the way that he did or she did, we need to make sure that they never have an opportunity to be around a child ever again. If you happen to know anything about Emily's case, please call the Bureau of Indian Affairs Special Agents at 505-917-7830. Now let's go back in time to when I put out a 3-part series called The Tangled Web about the Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow case. And if you haven't listened to that series, you should. I'm actually quite proud about it. That was a lot of research because it was a tangled web. But if you haven't listened to it, here's a quick summary. Lori Vallow is batshit crazy, and that's all you need to know. No, I'm just kidding. But batshit crazy Lori was then introduced to another Looney Toony man named Chad Daybell. And together, they decided they were going to start this weird offshoot from the Church of Latter-day Saints, this little doomsday cult. And they roped a few people in, one of which was her brother Alex Cox. The only problem with Lori's little love affair was Lori was already married, and so was Chad. So Alex ends up shooting Lori's husband, claiming it was self-defense, and for a while, police even believed him. Then, wouldn't you know it, Lori packs up pretty much right afterwards and moves her and her kids, Tylee and JJ, to Idaho to be closer to Chad. But then her kids aren't seen by anyone. And then Chad's wife suddenly dies just a few weeks later. Conveniently free of their partners, Chad and Lori headed to Hawaii to tie the knot. And let's see, more people get shot at. Thankfully, they survive. Alex suddenly dies, and everyone is wondering, where the heck are the kids? Tragically, JJ and Tylee would be found buried in Chad's backyard. Again, there's so much more to the story, so please check out the Tangled Web series for a full timeline and all the details. But when I left off coverage of that case, Lori and Chad had been arrested, and I do have some updates. Chad Daybell has been sentenced to death for the murder of his wife of almost 30 years, Tammy Daybell, and conspiracy to murder for the deaths of JJ Vallow, who is 7 years old, and Tylee Ryan, who is 16. Chad is going to have an automatic appeal because this is a death penalty case. It will go straight to the Idaho Supreme Court. This is mandatory, and frankly, it's a good thing that any death penalty case is required to get another look at. However, if I was a betting girl, I'm pretty sure that the Supreme Court of Idaho is going to do the right thing and uphold this conviction. But since his case will have an appeal, we probably aren't going to be getting a sit-down interview with him anytime soon to get answers. Unlike Lori, because Lori Vallow decided that while she was sentenced to multiple life sentences, no possibility of parole, for conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of Tammy Daybell and the murder of her 2 children, and even now as she prepares to go to trial for the conspiracy to kill her ex-husband, Lori decided she wanted to do a sit-down with my favorite television voice ever, Keith Morrison. Now, any lawyer worth a penny would have told her not to do this interview. It was a bad look. but especially why a trial is still pending. But guess what? Lori has taken a page out of Ted Bundy's book and is going to be defending herself in this upcoming trial, a trial that they haven't taken the death penalty off the table yet. Did you guys watch this interview? First off, I try not to talk poorly about people's appearances, but Lori is Lori, so I really don't care if I hurt her feelings. In fact, I hope I do. Lori Vallow is aging terribly, and you want to know why? Well, besides prison, I think it's because evil rots you. I firmly believe that. She was a conventionally very attractive woman. I think most people would agree with me. But when you're harboring that much vile toxicity inside of you, enough to make you capable of harming your own children, yeah, that's going to rot you from the inside out. And frankly, for someone who is as vain as she was, always wanting to be the center of attention and look at me, I kind of love the fact that she looks so terrible. Not only that, the interview was a disaster. And also, in the words of Will Smith, keep Keith Morrison's name out of your mouth. She kept going, "Is that right, Keith? Is that so, Keith?" She probably said his name 20 times for every 2 sentences. Have some respect. When Lori was sentenced, she made an interesting statement in court. She said that she had been speaking to Jesus as well as to her children and to Tammy, and that Tylee, JJ, and Tammy were, quote, happy and extremely busy in heaven. She also stated, Jesus Christ knows that no one was murdered in this case. Accidental deaths happen, suicides happen, fatal side effects from medications happen. Which is interesting because she didn't back up any of this or share this information with her lawyers in her defense, and Lori kept these claims going throughout the interview with Keith Morrison. While we don't know exactly what happened, and we probably will never know because Lori is full of nonsense and her brother is no longer alive to be questioned by police, it's pretty clear through phone evidence on Alex's phone and because he had killed for her before that Lori's brother Alex murdered Tylee and JJ. Lori may never have laid a hand on them herself, but she certainly put the plan in place. And regardless, she is the one responsible for JJ and Tylee no longer being on this earth. And I swear to God, not the one that she believes in because I don't want anything to do with a God that would tell a mom to hurt her children, but I swear if this woman has the audacity to blame Tylee or JJ for each other's deaths, well, I don't know what I will do. I guess I can't really do anything but send her a very strongly worded letter to prison. But after orchestrating the death of her children, if she's going to try to tarnish their memory by placing blame on them, then she truly is soulless and I don't think deserves forgiveness because forgiveness comes from repentance. And she clearly doesn't know what that word means. Keith Morrison was not able to get much out of Lori except possibly feeding her already inflated ego and need for attention. She commented about Jesus visiting her in prison, that her and Tammy are great friends, blah, 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 blah. But what made me want to reach through the screen and shake her was when she was talking about her belief that Chad and her would be exonerated and had the nerve to say, after I get exonerated, maybe I'll go on Dancing with the Stars and you can come and watch. Sure, I get it. She was being sarcastic, but 4 people are dead because of you, including your children. And you think that this is the time to crack a joke and think that anyone in America who knows this case, even if you somehow wormed your way out of the conviction, would want to celebrate you and watch you on TV? After watching that interview, I don't think I have any more answers. Does Lori actually believe all of this stuff? Like, is she mentally unwell? Or is she just a psychopath that has no empathy whatsoever, wants all the focus on her, and doesn't even really care for the destruction that she's caused? Lori's case in Arizona, where she's going to be representing herself, is supposed to start on March 31st, and the judge just ruled that he's going to allow the case to be live streamed. So consider this my advance notice to my workplace. I will be calling out sick because I have to keep you updated on this upcoming trial, because if the pre-trial hearings and the Dateline interview that I watched are any indication, this is going to be a mess. In the episode called The SD Card Killer, I did something that is a bit abnormal for me. I made hard judgments saying that I knew that Brian Stephen Smith was a serial killer. And sadly, while I love being right most of the time, I wish I had not been in this case. Brian Stephen Smith, the man who recorded himself killing Kathleen Jo Henry and then admitting to the murder of Veronica Abuchuk, was connected through digital evidence to Cassandra Boskovsky, another Alaskan Indigenous woman who had been missing since 2018. Police haven't positively identified her as a murder victim, but at a presumptive death hearing, which her family put into motion, the jury unanimously decided to declare her dead after Cassandra's family identified her as the woman in Brian Stephen Smith's phone pictures. She was bloody, beaten, and was either unconscious or had already passed away in the photos. Her body has not been recovered, and sadly, I just don't feel like this is going to be the last victim that will be tied to Brian Stephen Smith. I think truly there could even be victims in South Africa from where he's from. Time will tell, I guess, but I really, really wish I'd been wrong about him. In the episode Missing on Mother's Day, Suzanne Morphew, my previous co-host Annie, and my goodness, if you're listening, I miss you, girl. She covered the case of Suzanne Morphew, a woman who went missing on Mother's Day in 2020. This case became national news, with all eyes on her husband as the cause of her disappearance, especially after it was discovered that Suzanne had been carrying on an emotional affair with a friend from her past. People suspected that maybe Barry found out about the affair and something awful had transpired in their very expensive home here in Colorado. Suzanne's bike and helmet were found near her home, but after multiple searches by police and civilians, her body was not found. Despite her body not being found a year after her disappearance, Suzanne's husband Barry was arrested and charged with murder and tampering with evidence. The charges were later dropped in 2022. I guess they just didn't feel like they had enough. But they were dropped without prejudice, meaning he can still face those same charges again. Double jeopardy doesn't apply here, as they never went to trial. In cases like this, you want to believe there's still hope. Maybe she ditched her life and is somewhere on a beach drinking a Mai Tai. But knowing the type of mother Suzanne was reported to be, it's pretty clear that this case was not going to have a positive outcome. And sadly, that was true, because in September 2023, Suzanne Morphew's remains were found. Later, the autopsy report was released, and Suzanne had died of homicide. Although her body had been exposed to the elements far too long to determine the exact cause, but they were able to run a toxicology report. And it showed, and bear with me here, guys, because I'm not a doctor and I'm probably going to pronounce all of these incorrectly. Butorphanol, azaperone, and medetomidine. I can't. I don't know how to pronounce it. But those three chemicals were in her system, and they believe they could have been used, either the cause of her murder or used in her murder. Now, that's a lot of big words, all of which I am certain that I butchered the pronunciation of. But in layman's terms, she had animal tranquilizer recovered from her leg bone when they did the toxicology report. So let's go back and talk about some of the evidence that police collected and that Annie talked about during the episode. On the morning of May 9th, the day before Suzanne was reported missing, Barry's cell phone showed him moving quickly in a bizarre pattern outside of their house. Barry's explanation? He was hunting chipmunks that day. Because sure, that totally tracks. If Barry was part cheetah, I guess, because he was clocking speeds up to 45 miles per hour. And I've seen Barry. He is fit enough, but he is not running at 45 miles an hour. Or let's just hear me out. Maybe, because we live in the real world, it's more likely that when he got home at 2:44 p.m., he was chasing Suzanne as she ran from him, allegedly shooting her with a tranquilizer gun that, guess what, he conveniently owned. And fun fact, Barry actually had told investigators years before her remains were found that he used the same tranquilizer to immobilize deer so that he could remove their antlers. And the coincidences are sure coincidenting, aren't they? But don't worry, Barry swears the tranquilizer gun wasn't even working at the time of Suzanne's murder. How convenient. That seems a little bit suspicious, Barry. Because investigators found a cap for a tranquilizer dart in their home dryer. You know, where Barry allegedly tossed his clothes after washing them, probably post murder again, allegedly. And if all of this isn't shady enough, the very next day, Barry made 5 runs to different dumpsters. 5. So, Barry, what exactly were you throwing away? Of course, innocent until proven guilty and all of that. But with Suzanne's remains finally being discovered, I can only hope police don't stop until they bring the person responsible, or more likely, their original suspect, to trial. Annie also covered the then cold case of the Delphi murders, a tragedy that at the time everybody was talking about. In 2017, Abigail Williams and Liberty German were found dead, and for years their families waited for answers. And thankfully, since that episode aired, Richard Allen, a Delphi resident, was arrested in late 2022. Evidence linking him to the crime included an unspent bullet found at the scene that matched a firearm that he owned. Additionally, Richard Allen had made multiple confessions while in custody, not to police, but to cellmates and friends. It just seems like he couldn't really shut up about it. And this really solidified the case against him. But this trial was a mess, a hot mess. Somehow, crime scene photos were leaked to the public, which is terrible. Richard's defense team claimed he was innocent, and then they really went for it because they put out this wild theory that it wasn't Richard that did this. It was a pagan cult that was responsible for the murders. But finally, in December of last year, justice prevailed and Richard Allen was convicted of both murders and sentenced to 130 years in prison. And ABC News captured the moment of his sentencing perfectly. They reported, quote, Allen, wearing an orange jumpsuit, a gray sweatshirt, and ankle chains, looked over at the courtroom seats reserved for his family, which sat empty. None of his relatives attended the sentencing. And you know what? That's exactly what he deserves. To sit there alone, facing the weight of his actions for the rest of his life, and to feel the fear of what the next chapter is going to hold for him as the convicted killer of 2 young girls. Good luck in prison, Richard. You are going to need it. They don't take too kindly to child killers. And just as I thought this case was wrapped up and tied with a bow, this week authorities released the full version of the Bridge Guy video. This extended footage is heartbreaking, as it is likely the last moments of Abigail and Liberty's lives. You can hear one of the girls whisper, "Gun." It's heartbreaking. However, it was released by a group that feels that Richard Allen was wrongfully convicted, and his defense team has filed an appeal. So while we don't necessarily have conclusions to the cases that we touched on today, because there's appeals and trials that are ongoing, I hope that finding Suzanne's remains have brought her daughter some peace and potentially more clues in convicting her killer. And I hope the families of all the victims discussed today are one step further in their grieving process with the conviction of Lori and Chad Daybell and Richard Allen. I'm going to be keeping an eye on these cases and so many upcoming trials because there's a lot of big cases that are headed to trial this spring and summer. But that's going to be it for this episode because I am knee-deep in research for a case that has been highly requested. I'll see you all next week, but if you can, take a moment, share this podcast with a friend, make sure that you like, follow, subscribe, do all the things. And if you can leave a 5-star review, it really does help. As always, until then.